Thank you again, everyone, for joining this evening. We, as an organization who works to have a fair democracy that everyone is able to participate in, we felt like it was really important for us to host this conversation on a critical and timely issue. For the last 15 years, we have worked with historically Black colleges and universities to increase civic engagement, and we saw the effects of over-policing on those campuses. As many people would say, being in college or having a degree does not provide the safety that Black lives deserve. With that in mind, we are excited to have members of the Common Cause Student Action Alliance join us for the conversation tonight, and we hope to offer more intergenerational conversations on the issues that affect all of us and make the fight for a fair democracy very important. The need for criminal justice reform is not a new problem, but is one that has plagued Black communities for centuries. Before we begin, we would ask everyone to have a minute of reflection in silence for the Black lives that have been taken away due to acts of injustice. Thank you. I would now like to introduce our moderator for the night. Danielle Wooten is a Summer Democracy Fellow and a member of the Student Action Alliance. She recently graduated from North Carolina Central University with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. We are proud of Danielle's work from this past year, and we're excited to have her lead us in this conversation. And just as far as logistics go, feel free to put questions in the chat. We have folks that are moderating the chat and that would respond to those questions. And we'll also save some of those questions for our panelists at the end of their presentations about the different parts of the Justice and Policing Act.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Tonight we'll begin with our 3 speakers, followed by a Q&A, and conclude with a call to action. If you're interested in working with our action team tonight, by reaching out to voters, please stay on for a brief training on phone banking. Those who are trained will have an opportunity to contact Arizona members and urge that they call their senators to ask that they vote for Justice and Policing Act. And without further ado, tonight's speakers are KRISTINE Kippins, who is the Constitutional Accountability Center's Director of Policy. Prior to joining the CAC, KRISTINE served as a Federal Policy Counsel at the Center for Reproductive Rights. She was responsible for advancing and protecting abortion and health policy at the federal level. KRISTINE received her JD from William & Mary Law School and BS from the University of Pennsylvania Walton School of Business. She currently serves on the board of directors of the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States. Also joining us is TIERRA Bradford, who joined the National Office of Common Cause in August 2018. As a legal fellow, doing research and writing for the Mass Incarceration Project, in addition to working with Common Cause's voting rights and election protection programs. She now serves as policy manager for Common Cause Maryland, where she is responsible for development and implementation of policy campaigns, research and communications, coalition management, outreach, and direct lobbying. TIERRA completed her undergraduate studies at Hampton University and went to receive a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. And last but certainly not least, ANIKA BOWIE has served as executive of Minneapolis NAACP, the oldest civil rights organization in the nation since 2016. She has led and continues to lead Ramsey County Warrant Resolution Day initiative, which helped hundreds of people get their lives restored. She dedicated her professional career advocating for communities impacted by criminal justice system as a teaching artist and a community organizer since 2008. She currently serves on St. Paul Police Civilian Internal Affairs Review Commission and leads to Restore the Vote Minnesota Coalition of over 50 organizations throughout the state. A big welcome to all you ladies, and thank you for joining us tonight. Okay, we will begin starting off our conversation tonight with an overview of the Justice and Policing Act, what the coalition has requested, and how the CAC has engaged Congress. We'll begin with KRISTINE Kippins.
Thanks so much for that, Danielle. Again, my name is KRISTINE Kippins. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy at the Constitutional Accountability Center, or CAC for short. On June 1st, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights sent Congress a letter outlining 8 accountability principles that must be adopted as a baseline to address rampant systemic white supremacy in law enforcement across America. In less than 12 hours, more than 450 of this country's most diverse civil rights, civil liberties, and racial justice organizations, including CAC, signed on to that letter because what was asked of Congress aligned with what advocates, policing experts, and other stakeholders agree is needed. The priorities are not only reasonable, but reflect a bare minimum of what must be in any policing legislation Congress adopts in order for systemic reform to occur. These 8 priorities are: 1, changing the national use of force standard for federal officers from reasonableness to unless necessary as a last resort to prevent death or serious bodily injury. 2, a ban on chokeholds. 3, a ban on racial, religious, and discriminatory profiling. 4, the establishment of a police misconduct registry containing information on misconduct complaints, discipline and termination records, and records of certification. 5, the inclusion of a reckless standard in Section 242 of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, which enables federal prosecutors to hold law enforcement accountable for civil rights violations, for criminal civil rights violations, excuse me. Number 6, a prohibition on no-knock warrants, especially in drug cases. Number 7, the demilitarization of law enforcement agencies. And 8, the elimination of the judge-made doctrine of qualified immunity. So Republicans responded to this demand by ignoring them. The Just and Unifying Solutions to Invigorate Communities Everywhere Act, or the Justice Act, introduced by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, has absolutely no accountability measures. It amounts to data collection and commissioning studies to study a problem we already know quite a bit about. So I'm not going to waste anyone's time here talking about it. The Democrats, however, responded with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which I'll refer to from here on out as the JPA. And that passed with bipartisan support in the House last Thursday. It's not a perfect bill, but it does at least address the 8 priorities that the civil rights community put forth to Congress. And it even goes further than what was asked for. And here are a few of those additions. It would also require the Attorney General to analyze existing accreditation standards for all levels of law enforcement nationwide. The JPA would create a duty for federal law enforcement officers to intervene in instances where they witness a fellow officer's use of excessive force. It would establish a grant program to strengthen and expand pattern or practice investigations, both at the state and federal levels. It would provide additional funding for civil rights enforcement and conflict resolution. It would require federal uniformed police officers to wear body cameras and have dashboard cameras on marked vehicles. And it would create a new civil rights violation for lynching by making it a federal crime to conspire to violate existing hate crimes laws. But there are a few pieces of the bill that are problematic. The JPA does not prevent quick knock raids for drug cases. While the bill takes a good first step in prohibiting the use of no-knock warrants in drug cases, its provisions don't go far enough. Quick knock raids are just as deadly and must be prohibited for drug cases. Additionally, these provisions should be tied to federal funding grants. The JPA does not end the transfer of military equipment to state and local law enforcement agencies. While the bill, again, takes a very good first step in limiting the transfer of certain military equipment through the 1033 program, the bill does not eliminate the program entirely. The increased transfer of equipment through the 1033 program has been shown to increase the number of police killings in communities and must be eliminated. The JPA does not eliminate school-based law enforcement. Provisions in the bill allowing for grant funds to develop uniform standards on school safety raise coalition concerns about reinforcing the role of law enforcement in schools through the use of school resource officers. The JPA currently contains language that would restrict public disclosure of the police misconduct registry. That language needs to be removed, as everyone needs to be able to know about police misconduct. Furthermore, the bill does not require the use of force reporting for federal officers, so that language needs expansion. And the final problematic piece of the JPA is the fact that it does not end qualified immunity. And this is the piece of the fight that my organization has been kind of leading on. Now, if you've been watching the news and they're talking about the JPA, you would think that the bill ends qualified immunity the way everyone's talking about it, but that's not the full story. The JPA ends qualified immunity for local law enforcement and local law enforcement alone. However, the judge-made doctrine that prevents people from holding state actors accountable when those state officials deprive people of their rights is much broader than law enforcement. So what the JPA does by ending qualified immunity only for state law enforcement, instead of doing it across the board, is that it codifies the judge-made doctrine, which actually does not exist anywhere in the statute. The court made it up. In addition, this also says that Congress approves of certain groups being held accountable for depriving people of their civil and constitutional rights, but not others. And we know that this is not how the Constitution is meant to work. Our rights are little more than words on paper if there are no accountability measures to back them up when we're deprived of them. And that's why CAC supports HR 7085, the Ending Qualified Immunity Act by Representatives Justin Amash and Ayanna Pressley, which would end qualified immunity for all state actors. So I'll end by saying, while the JPA is not perfect, it represents an important first step towards comprehensive policing reform. As been recognized throughout this process, more action will be necessary, and we all need to remain vigilant. As a community, we need to continue to press for provisions expanding the prohibition of no-knock warrants, eliminating qualified immunity writ large, and ensuring that individuals and communities are able to effectively demand accountability from federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kristine. Now on to TIERRA Bradford, who I'd like to ask, what has Common Cause done to address the need for criminal justice reform, and how does reform address other issues we see in the Black community, such as over-policing, mass incarceration, and so on?
Thanks, everyone, and good evening. Again, I'm TIERRA Bradford. I'm Policy Manager for Common Cause Maryland. And I'm going to break up the role that Common Cause and Common Cause Maryland play in this fight into three categories, and that's education, support, and advocacy. For instance, with our mass incarceration project that we have in the national office, one of the things we've tried to do is work as an educational tool. For example, in our Democracy Behind Bars report, we briefly touched on police funding and how there's kind of a correlation between the federal funding for policing and the militarization of the police, and how that can lead to more casualties for civilians. And so we touched on that kind of amongst the other issues that the Mass Incarceration Project works on. I think, and the second role we play is support, and I think that's the most important role that Common Cause plays with this type of issue and with these types of conversations. Because we're a group that mostly focuses on democracy issues, I think it's very important that our type of organization spends this time lifting up our partners who work on criminal justice reform all the time and who worked on policing reform and defunding police like 100% of the time, you know. And so whether that's signing on to letters, providing written testimony, any type of support that we can bring to those organizations is great. And just making sure that we make it clear in the media that we are behind these types of reforms that are happening and what our partners are working on. And lastly, a lot of the advocacy that Common Cause and Common Cause Maryland does has to do with issues that are a bit attenuated from criminal justice reform. For example, our main issues in our mass incarceration project include felony disenfranchisement, prison gerrymandering, and the correctional industry influence on politics. And these are all things that are related to criminal justice reform, because if you're over policing these communities, then what results is people have other issues that they have to deal with down the line. There are only, for example, there are only 2 states that allow people who are incarcerated to vote while they're incarcerated, and that's Maine and Vermont. And so you have a bunch of people who are losing their right to vote because they are incarcerated. And in some states, depending on what state you're in, you may never get your voting rights back. Or if you do get your voting rights back, you may not be told that your voting rights have been restored, and et cetera. So those are the types of issues that Common Cause personally advocates for during General Assembly sessions and through other ways. And also, for example, an issue that Common Cause Maryland has been working on is voting in jail. In Maryland, when you are in jail and if you are pre-trial or if you've been convicted of a misdemeanor, you do have the right to vote, but there is not a mechanism in place to make sure that people who have the right to vote who are in jail are actually able to vote when you're in Maryland. And so these are the type of issues and the type of damage and harm that can come from a broken criminal justice system. Like, it doesn't just stop at arrest, it doesn't just stop at brutality. These are issues that continue way down the line. And so those are the issues that we directly work on. I believe I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you, Tierra. And finally, I'd like to ask Ms. ANIKA BOWIE, who hails from the city who is now at the forefront of this issue, that city being Minneapolis. In your opinion, what will it really take to have justice in policing?
Hey everyone. Hey, I just want to say my name is ANIKA BOWIE, but it's all right. It's all love. It's all good. And I appreciate that question. First, I just want to put in context just with what the Minneapolis NAACP's relationship with Common Cause. Minnesota is a really positive one in terms of, boots on the ground advocacy and making sure that we're influencing the lawmakers at the Capitol. We have worked together for the past, I want to say 3 years, 3 years plus on particularly Restore the Vote. So like the person said before around like protecting democracy, is all wrapped together with protecting justice, right? And, to really address your question around justice, what is justice in policing? Me, as a person, African-American, a Black person here in Minnesota and who's on ground zero in Minneapolis, I think that question needs to be changed into for whom, right? What does justice in policing looks like for the African-American? And that really looks like a change in the culture of policing, because you can change the laws, you can change policy, right? But if the culture of policing is not being held accountable or being transformed, you're going to continue attracting the same people who historically are incentivized, right, to continue the legacy of policing where it has its roots in slave capturing. And how you can actually address that is through consequences. We know right now in our current justice system, they utilize the courts to sentence, to incarcerate, to rehabilitate, to lawsuits, resolutions, right, restitution. We need that similar mindset when it comes to policing, to where these consequences could be financial. These consequences could be people leaving the table. And these consequences, what we see now in the city of Minneapolis, a entire defunding of your budget and your existence. So that transformation can be in the leadership. We know here in Minneapolis, the president of the union here for the Minnesota Police Association is Bob Crow. And if you do your research on Bob Crow and listen to really what he has to say in response to not only George Floyd, but so many lives that were taken previously, he has a vested interest in protecting his law enforcement officers. And that's by any means necessary. So there needs to, be a change in that leadership. There's a lot of boots on the ground energy and protest that is addressing that. We also need to see a change, what's happening right now, a change in the charter. And I'm really, really thankful for people like Common Cause, NAACP, so many civil rights organizations and activists who understand the importance of looking at local politics and influencing local politics, because we understand the local leadership, the city council has a huge influence on the lives, how policing takes place. Another thing that we can do to really address, justice and policing is insurance. I know this has been a conversation around what does it look like for officers to take responsibility, right? To where the liability of someone who loses their life to policing doesn't fall on the shoulders of taxpayers, right? But it falls on the shoulders of that very police officer who is licensed, who is a licensed professional. I would say anyone who has a license should also have insurance to back it. But here we see with policing, the city, the people of the city usually carry the burden. Another thing that we can change, and this is more in the judicial system, is really restructuring its function. The rulings of our judges are really going to take precedence of what is acceptable, what is what is legal, and how the public really perceived how our system and our law and order functions in this world. So restructuring its function, I'm someone who approaches this in multiple ways, for as a policy lens, but also a racial and a cultural lens, in that you can change laws, but laws often doesn't help to change behavior. And what changes behavior is really naming the problem. And we know here in Minneapolis and all across the globe, the problem is white supremacy. And we need to create a model that is not rooted in like a European draconian model of punishment, to where you are punished, therefore you lose a life, right? No, we need to move to a model of restorative or transformation, to where you do something wrong and we are actually addressing the issue, the core of the problem, and relying on that human being to transform and support them in their rehabilitation and support them in their change of behavior to make sure that they are part of a community, right? So that's where we're at when it comes to the Minneapolis NAACP. We have an amazing team of a criminal justice reform committee, Dr. Raj, who I was a co-chair with, where we are leading these conversations with our judges, with our lawmakers, with even people who came out of prison or people who are in prison, because we believe, just like Congresswoman Ayanna Presley had mentioned, the people closest to the problem should be the people closest to the power, changing policy. And that's our theory and that's our lens. And like I said before, we need eliminating immunity, where that is half of the battle, because before you can hold police officers accountable, they first have to be viewed in the eyes of the court as people, that aren't exempt from the laws that we have. So I just appreciate this conversation in terms of honoring the lives and honoring the work that we have to do moving forward to make sure justice and policing includes Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, immigrants, trans lives, so many people that's often left out of the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Anika, sorry about the name. I'd like to thank all you ladies for answering my questions. We will now open up to audience questions on this matter. We ask audience members to type their questions in the chat as previously stated. And please keep in mind that we're on a time limit and mean no offense if your question isn't presented before the panel. Okay, and first question from the audience is to KRISTINE. It says, can you please elaborate on the impact you believe the JP Act will have in Black and Brown communities?
So I want to echo something that Anika said, and that is that you cannot have justice without accountability. And that is a big part of the JPA. Now, I said it is not a perfect bill. It is not the silver bullet to ending police violence in our over-policed neighborhoods. But it is a good start. It's a good first step, because breaking down systemic racism and white supremacy that is baked into our systems isn't going to happen overnight from DC. But again, this is a good jumping off point. So, you know, the current language establishes a national standard of use for force. It prohibits chokeholds. It bars racial profiling. It makes changes to allow prosecutors to more successfully hold law enforcement officers accountable for deprivation of rights. It also creates data collection and sharing measures that will increase transparency and accountability for police departments. So I think accountability, stating the fact that there is a problem here, what you have been doing and are doing is wrong, and we will hold you accountable for this, is going to be one of the effects that we see in our neighborhoods. But again, it is going to take time, and this is the first step that Congress is making towards this. So we need to make sure that we hold their feet to the fire, and that this is not the last policing bill that we see from them.
Okay, and to KRISTINE once again, we have another question for you. David asks, can you describe the difference between a quick knock warrant and a no knock warrant?
Sure. So they're almost self-explanatory. So the no knock warrants allow police to enter your domicile without any announcement whatsoever. There are certain specifications that they need to provide to a judge in order to get that type of warrant. Now, the step below that is a quick knock warrant, where the police still have to announce themselves before they come into the domicile. But there's like, it's kind of squishy as to like how long they need to wait before they knock and enter. So it's a very, very problematic gray area there when it comes into actual practice of quick knocks and whether or not they're done in accordance with the law. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, KRISTINE. Now moving on to TIERRA, the question for you. What are things people can do to help hold those who are in power accountable, i.e. elected officials or police officers?
Thanks. So I think what we've all been seeing, like in the news and on social media and everywhere, is that protesting does work and signing those petitions does work. I mean, making your voices heard on the outside and causing an uproar, those are things that elected officials pay attention to. So if anyone ever tries to say that those types of things don't work, well, we've seen that they actually do. And of course, I wouldn't be a Common Cause employee if I didn't say that voting is definitely another way to hold people accountable. Your vote is so powerful, whether you use it or not. Even if you're not voting, you're still voting in a way because you've elected for the person who won to take their position. So that's another way to hold people accountable. Also, I don't think people realize that showing up is another way to hold people accountable, whether that's to town halls, to meetings, to hearings. there's so many policy issues that we work on during General Assembly, for example, General Assembly sessions that don't get us much attention because there's not a lot of the public who show up to discuss those issues or to discuss that legislation. And so elected officials feel like, you know, it doesn't matter if they vote on it or not. So just showing up to those types of things are really important. If you are a writer and a researcher, even writing an op-ed and trying to get it submitted somewhere, discussing an issue and bringing attention to certain elected officials and different agencies in the government, that's another way to hold people accountable. And so there are a lot of different ways you can hold people accountable, even on an individual level. If you're just talking to your family and friends about what's going on and educating people, that's basically the first step of accountability, right? Because if no one knows what their elected official is doing, then they're not going to know that there is something to hold them accountable for. So even on an individual level, just doing research yourself and talking to people is very important. And as far as police officers, from a democracy standpoint, a transparency standpoint, getting the police to agree to be more transparent with the community. I know there was reform, for example, we were working on this past session that was asking the police to let people who made complaints against them be able to check in on those complaints and see what the progress of the investigation was. Because currently they're not able to do so. And so supporting those types of reforms and legislation is another way to hold people in power accountable.
Thank you, Tierra. Now moving on to Anika, we have a question for you. What are the effects that you've seen your city council made to address the concerns of the community?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of traction, actually. Our city council in Minneapolis have been, majority, if not all of them, have made a very bold response where they had introduced an amendment to defund the police, create a new department called Community Safety and Violence Prevention, and where pretty much the role of policing, they had changed that name. So they totally gutted the police department terminology out of there and turned it into law services division, to where there's going to be a director of the law service division that is going to oversee the licensed police officers that we'll still have in Minneapolis. And you know, not to go too far into the bill because I'm not the city council member, but just from like our observations, and I can give that information as well of the bill, or excuse me, of the ordinance. So there's amendments that's been made that removes all the references, and then the next phases of this amendment, or excuse me, ordinance that was brought forth. So this ordinance was brought forth actually 2 weeks after George Floyd's death. And activists like ourselves, probably familiar with Black Visions Collective, Reclaim the Block, and so many you know, people who have loved ones who were taken from police officers, particularly in Minneapolis, all came forth and put pressure on the city council. And the city council, one, verbalized that they will agree to defund. Now what our next steps that we're seeing here is it's going to move into a ballot initiative, to where the people of Minneapolis are going to vote on whether or not to have a change, right, in policing and its function, to where we can have a more focus on what does community safety looks like, and then what does violence prevention looks like as well too. They just opened some days ago, opened up for community comments. So before we take a stance on it, we definitely want to know what our community feels about it, thinks about it. There's so many people that have about 30+ years invested into police reform. including ourselves. So we want to really make sure that this supports that work, and that it also supports the needs and the real safety, of the community here in Minneapolis.
Okay, next question is for Tierra. Charles from California asks, the concept of defunding the police department is ambiguous. Should the concept of defunding the police department be clarified or not be used?
Other panelists, please feel free to also jump in on this. So with defunding the police, I know we work in coalition with the Leadership Conference, and I believe we're trying to use the divest from the police terminology, but defund and divest basically mean the same thing. It does not mean to move police officers around, and it also doesn't mean that we're totally getting rid of the police out of our society. What it means is we're taking money away from all the money that's being put towards police departments and putting it in other areas. Like, for example, a lot of the communities that are being over-policed, they don't have great education systems in place. And so resources that are being put towards the police departments could be put towards education instead, or other types of social services that could actually help build up the community, instead of just throwing a bunch of money at police departments and expecting a change when all this time, no type of change and no type of real, there hasn't been a real decrease in policing efforts. And so, yeah, that's really what defunding police means. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak on that as well.
Do any other panelists wish to respond to the question?
So CAC does not have a position on defunding versus divesting. I will just say, that what I have observed in people who are relatively new to this space is when they see the pie charts or the bars, of city budgets and state budgets when it comes to policing versus all the other services that the municipality or the state might provide, they get why this divestment needs to happen. So I just wanted to flag that, like, the visualization of the argument oftentimes is very helpful in getting the point across.
And I also want to add, I think someone had mentioned it earlier, that the police, law enforcement, city police is not the only type of policing that we should focus on, that there's, county sheriffs that have, play a huge part in people's lives. There's state patrol. There's so many, it depends on each state. But I do want to also reference here in Minneapolis and also in St. Paul, the school board actually have removed their safety resource officers, which were pretty much police. They had a contract with the Minneapolis Police Department and also St. Paul's Police Department. And just by ending that contract with them, removing police out of their schools, and then investing in other professions and other organizations that can come in and help with safety.
Thank you, ladies. Back to Kristine real quick. Cheryl from Minnesota asks, how likely is it that a bill will pass both the House and the Senate? It is so frustrating to see that it has not gotten anything done yet. We need this bill at this time. It is critical if we move things forward. Now is the time.
Yes, I agree with that sentiment 100%. And that's the big question, right? So it has already passed the House, which is fantastic. So that means that the pressure is now on the Senate in order to pass it. The problem with the Senate is that its leader is Mitch McConnell, and he does not have any qualms about he's very proud of his Senate graveyard, where he has these progressive bills that have passed the House and are literally buried in the graveyard by his hand. So, he is trying to back the Justice Act, which is the Tim Scott bill, which I mentioned earlier has absolutely no accountability measures. Therefore, what justice is this Justice Act providing? Which is why the hashtag when we talk about the Justice Act is the hashtag No Justice Act. So it's not very likely that the JPA will pass during the 116th Congress. That does not mean that we don't give up on this bill. Now, it is extremely important to keep pressuring the Senate to improve upon this bill. You know, I went through all the areas in which the bill is lacking. So we need to keep that pressure up and let them know that this bill is imperfect and it needs to be better, and you need to change the language, and we need to have a hearing on it, and we need to talk about this, and we are not going away, because the 116th Congress isn't going to be the last Congress of the United States of America. You have the 117th coming up very soon, and we might have a very, very different composition. So the time that we invest now is critically important to the type of legislation we're going to see next Congress. So yes, sad news now about the likelihood of the JPA, but again, the time that we invest now is so important, so we cannot let up.
Thank you. And Anika, Valerie from California asks, do you think we could come up with a way to have someone other than someone with a gun to respond to calls of persons who look suspicious?
Absolutely. I totally agree with that vision that we don't have to always call to someone who has a gun and a badge for help. You know, there are initiatives here already in Minnesota to where if you have a technical equipment issue with your vehicle, say like a headlight, you know, for instance, with Philando Castile, that law enforcement don't have to take that responsibility of giving people a ticket, that we can have another entity that gives people even a credit or some type of stipend or a reminder to get their headlight fixed, right? We know with domestic violence, although it is very dangerous, but like for domestic violence calls should be paired with a mental health person, or any like assault call or mental health costs. Part of the, you know, the nuance, or just I guess the need of more education is that our police officers aren't able to really distinguish something as a mental health issue or more of like a cultural thing, language barriers. There's so many different barriers to where the lens of an officer can see, you know, a certain population or individual or incident as dangerous when it's really not, you know, as dangerous of a situation. So yes, I agree that we should be more investing in people that do not have guns or badges to help with our, you know, public safety.
Thank you, Anika. Back to Christine. David asks, holding prosecutors accountable is an important step in securing justice. Is any legislation currently in the pipeline to hold prosecutors accountable for not doing their part in being an additional line of defense in relation to law enforcement?
Now that is a great question. You know, anybody who's watched Law and Order knows that, you know, the prosecutors and the police have a very, very tight relationship, and oftentimes prosecutors act in accordance with maintaining that relationship. So yes, bringing these charges when it's local prosecutors who need to bring it proves to be quite problematic. And on top of it, prosecutors have absolute immunity. They don't have qualified immunity, they have absolute immunity, which is something that CAC has been fighting against, honestly, since its founding. But we've been doing that in the courts. As far as I know, there isn't any pending legislation tackling prosecutorial immunity, but I'll be sure to look into that and circle back with the Common Cause crew in case that proves to be not true, but I'm pretty sure that there isn't any existing legislation tackling that subject right now. But it's a great question.
Thank you. And back to Anika. Linda asks, do police departments today regularly schedule psychological tests to warn of potential aggressive behavior in their workforce?
Oh, you're on mute, Anika.
Thank you. Can you hear now? Okay, perfect. I was saying that was a phenomenal question because it really varies from police departments. From my previous experience as a police civilian internal affairs review commissioner, long title, but in our training of understanding our current police department in St. Paul, found out that they only get a psych evaluation every 3 years, and that's just upon request. That's more so like the officer themselves wanting to do some, I guess, self-check on themselves, and that is protected. You know, that information, you know, obviously isn't really released. But that was part of, with Minneapolis NAACP, some of our demands that we need to have, if not monthly, yearly, psychological checks, just because they are in a field of really high trauma, exposed to it on a daily. So that's definitely a need for that. Like I said, there's a lot of protections when it comes, a lot of red tape around that, because that's really more of the jurisdiction of the union and the post board. And the post board is ran heavily by law enforcement, who really just protect the issue and don't really try to, isn't really as savvy or in tune with, mental health and destigmatizing mental health when it comes to policing.
Thank you, Anika. And next question is posed for Kristine. As we've seen, there's a major problem with false 911 calls for non-police issues, like calling 911 on a bird watcher. That can result in a needless tragedy. Dennis asks, how can those who file false complaints, 911 calls, be held accountable?
Okay, so I am not an expert on this, but I believe that most states have laws against making false 911 reports, and I think most of them are misdemeanors. So they're already trying to make sure that folks don't abuse the 911 call. Now, with the example of the bird watcher, it was important that there was video attached, right? Because if you just listen to the audio of the call, you might believe that this woman was actually in distress as opposed to play acting, which you could tell because you had the context of the call thanks to the video, but you wouldn't know that just from the call or the transcript. So there, of course, there are still gaps there because it's going to be hard to determine what actually constitutes a false 911 call when you don't have something like an accompanying video to go with it. But yeah, I do believe that it is a state level issue, and most states already have something on the books on that.
Thank you. Next question is for Anika. Jacqueline Deere asks, in addition to calls for demilitarizing and disarming law enforcement, are there calls for demilitarizing and disarming our neighborhoods and communities?
If I think, my interpretation of that is that there's a call for demilitarizing police, and is there something like that to demilitarize our communities, like a neighborhood? Well, I guess if the person could probably add a little bit more to it, but I can approach it in terms of here in Minnesota, in response to, for example, Philando Castile and his murder, there was, I believe, $20 million that was invested into the police department to train themselves, to not to prevent, this police-involved shootings. And part of that conversation around how that millions of dollars was going to be spent was to ensure that we didn't have what is called warrior-style training here, to where they intentionally train officers on how to utilize all uses of forces. So we were against that. Another conversation that's being had now that we're, the aftermath of the uprisings, leading into that transition to the aftermath. Governor Tim Walz had called for the National Guard and called for, tens of thousands of military forces to be utilized here. We definitely want to make sure that we're not leaning too heavily on military to protect us, but we are investing into communities to protect themselves. And that's what Minneapolis NAACP definitely did. Our response was, community who do have the rights to bear arms should be, utilizing those rights and protecting their homes, protecting their businesses, and protecting their loved ones in the presence of white supremacist groups and, militia groups as well.
And that was our last question from the audience. I would like to thank you ladies for your time and coming here to discuss with me about this issue. And now I would like to address the audience and say this webinar is your call to action. Several participants have asked how can they help, and there are 3 actions you can take now. Write an LT about the importance of community action and police reform. Join us on transparency training program to demand local government entities, including city councils and police departments, to be open for public notice, observation, participation, and deliberation. Join our action team tonight and phone bank tonight to encourage our Arizona members to patch through calls to Senators McSally and SEMA to demand their support for Justice and Policing Act. Our associate Herb will be training immediately following off the webinar. I'd like to thank you ladies again for joining the discussion with me.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate this.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Herb. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the national campaigner here with Common Cause. So we're going to get started today with a quick phone bank training. So we'll be calling into Common Cause. I'm going to share my screen here. Alrighty. So we'll be calling into Arizona. We'll be calling our Common Cause activists in Arizona, and we're going to be telling them to demand that their senator, Senator McSally, vote yes on the Justice and Policing Act. So the reason that we're calling Senator McSally is because she's a vulnerable senator that's up for re-election this November. If Mitch McConnell is hearing from a multitude of vulnerable senators, he'll be more inclined to bring this bill to a vote. So we are going through and shifting through vulnerable senators up for re-election who have not signed on yet. And this time we're focusing on McSally. So I'm going to show you quickly what a virtual phone bank looks like, and that's something that we'll all be using. So soon after this, in the chat, I believe Aaron shared a join Slack link. Feel free to click that. I can also give you directions on how to click that after this slide. But in that Slack, you'll get directions to go to the virtual phone bank link, which is right here. If you've never made calls before, that's okay. That's what this training is for. And if you've never used a virtual phone bank before, that's okay too. If you haven't used a phone bank before, it'll just prompt you to make a quick account. And then you'll be good to go. It takes maybe 20 seconds. It asks for your email, make a password, and it'll direct you to this screen that you're seeing right here. What you do is you just click Get Started, and immediately it'll take you to a Common Cause activist in Arizona. So it'll have a Common Cause activist in Arizona. It'll have their number, and then it'll have a script that I've written out for you. And then Danielle and I are going to role play the script real quick. It's a pretty simple script. Feel free to read it before you make a call, and we'll be good to go. So Danielle, are you ready?
Yep. Ready.
Okay. So I'm going to be the volunteer calling, and Danielle is going to be the Common Cause activist in Arizona picking up the phone. So, hi, is Danielle available?
Yes, she's speaking.
Hi, Danielle. I'm Herb, and I'm a grassroots volunteer with Common Cause. How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm great. Thanks for asking. So I was actually just giving you a quick call to thank you for being part of our organization to hold power accountable. As you know, we are in the midst of a civil rights uprising. There's never been a more important time in our history to stand up for what we believe in and combat systemic racism within our country and our policing system. A police reform bill passed in the House and now is moving to the Senate. The bill will provide a first step toward comprehensive accountability measures that are necessary to address systemic constitutional violations by law officers. Senator McSally can support this bill with your help. Can you call and pressure her to vote for this bill? The best way for McConnell to allow a vote on this if he hears it from vulnerable senators up for re-election, just like Senator McSally. So can we count on you to call your senator and demand they support the Justice and Policing bill?
Yes.
Awesome. So when they say yes, because when they pick up, more likely than not, they'll say yes. They're Common Cause members. They're ready to take some action. So you click an option or choose an option and put yes. The reason why you're doing that is because later after this phone bank, I can pull and see how many people said yes. So I've listed the number right here of the number to McSally's office. So you can do two things. You can ask them to pick up pen and paper and write it down to give her a call. If you are able to, you could tell them that you can connect them to that number to this number by merging the calls together. It's up to you, whatever you feel better with. If you feel comfortable merging the calls, I do recommend that because then you know for a fact that they're calling them. Under this script, you can say all you have to do is let her know your name, where you live, and that you demand she votes yes in the Justice Policing Act. If they say no and are adamant about it, you can try to convince them. You can tell them, it's really important. I'm a volunteer calling you, and I've called my senator. If they're adamant about not calling, just say, okay, no worries. And then you can say, if you're interested in getting involved in the future, go to www.commoncause.org/act, and that'll take them to our action team that you're going to be a part of. So that's what we have right here, and what we're going to do is get started. I realize that I went kind of quickly, so no worries. If you have any questions in the chat, I'll be sure to stay on and look at them. And you can also ask them when you join the Slack channel. So to do that, I'm going to move this part of the screen right here. To do that, just go to www.commoncause.org/join Slack. And then once you are in Slack, you will be automatically added into the phone bank channel. And then in that phone bank channel, I've made a post with the virtual phone bank link. It'll be all self-explanatory right there. And if you have any questions, I'll stay on the Zoom. I know I saw some questions being asked in the chat. I'll stay on the Zoom. I'll answer all of them as long as everyone is phone banking. We're going to try to phone bank for about an hour or so. It's 3 hours ahead. It's 5:30 right now in Arizona. So I think, this is a perfect time to call. The contact rate should be relatively high. Let's get started. So if you haven't yet, go to commoncause.org/join Slack and join the Slack. I'm going to begin answering questions on the Zoom chat.